Hi class, in this recording we're going to focus on how the respiratory system and the urinary system helps to regulate pH. We've already talked about how the bicarbonate buffering system is significantly linked to our respiratory system. It's going to be the buffering associated with our respiratory system. And as we add more carbon dioxide to the blood, in other words, as we hold our breath more or as we breathe in and out less, more carbon dioxide causes the pH to go down because we're adding more hydrogen ions. More hydrogen ions means more acidic. More acidic means a lower pH. And then conversely, the more we breathe in and out, the more carbon dioxide we get rid of, the fewer hydrogen ions we have in our blood, and the more basic our blood becomes. The pH goes up with the more carbon dioxide we exhale. And this system can remove 2 to 3 times as much acid as the chemical buffers can all by themselves. So our ability to exhale carbon dioxide is very effective at removing or regulating our body's pH. As we look at our carbon dioxide in our respiratory system, usually we are going to be constantly making and eliminating carbon dioxide at the same rate. When we have aerobic metabolism, so particularly when we're working with the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, we're always going to be pumping out that carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide that we pump out with those two metabolic pathways will be exhaled at an equivalent rate. If we start making more carbon dioxide, metabolically speaking, so in other words, you're exercising and increasing the demand for ATP, so you upregulate cellular respiration. Ultimately, you dump more carbon dioxide into your bloodstream. That carbon dioxide will then be converted to carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid will dissociate to liberate or release hydrogen ions, and that will lower the pH. So in other words, to really break it down, if you increase your metabolic demand for ATP by, let's say, exercising, blood pH has a tendency to go down. And to compensate for that, we need to breathe out more. We need to expire more carbon dioxide. So in response to an uptick in carbon dioxide production, we will respond by increasing the amount of carbon dioxide we expire, and by exhaling that carbon dioxide, we are going to lower the concentration of carbon dioxide, which pushes the chemical reaction this way, ultimately removing hydrogen ions from solution and elevating the pH back up to where homeostasis is supposed to be. So to really emphasize this, as we have more carbon dioxide in the blood, that causes pH to go down, and that will cause us to breathe in and out more. It causes an increase in the rate of pulmonary ventilation. Conversely, if pH goes up too much, we don't have enough acid in the bloodstream, and our body responds by slowing down the rate or inhibiting the rate of pulmonary ventilation so that we build up carbon dioxide in our bloodstream and lower the blood pH back down to where it needs to be. So we have some negative feedback loops here to help us maintain homeostasis. As we look at our kidneys and the renal control of pH, our kidneys are more powerful than either the respiratory system or the chemical buffers for controlling our pH. And that's because our urinary system is going to be constantly eliminating an aqueous solution of hydrogen ions, or if needed, bicarbonate ions from our body. So as we look at the renal tubules, we have the proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. We're going to have lots of hydrogen ions being dumped into the filtrate or tubular fluid as the fluid is being processed within the glomerulus. Those hydrogen ions that we dump into the tubular fluid or filtrate bind to bicarbonates, ammonia, and phosphates within the forming urine. We are then still going to dump even more hydrogen ions. And those hydrogen ions that are free are going to be excreted in the urine. And that's how we lower the overall pH of our body, by expelling hydrogen ions from our body. Those other buffering systems in our bodies, particularly the chemical buffering systems, they can only reduce the concentration of hydrogen ions by binding the hydrogen ions to other chemicals within solution. It's a temporary fix. It's a Band-Aid approach to a pH imbalance. Ultimately, to correct the body's pH imbalances, we need to physically remove the hydrogen ions from our body, and we do that via urination. There's a lot on this slide. Let's just camp on this slide for probably 5 minutes. So let's talk about how we can neutralize hydrogen ions by secreting them from the body. This is a multi-step process that's going to involve some review from our urinary system. Step number 1 is that we have excess hydrogen ions in the blood. Those hydrogen ions in the blood react with bicarbonate ions to form carbonic acid. So we have too many hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions form carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid is going to dissociate into a water molecule and a carbon dioxide molecule. Excuse me. That water molecule is going to pass into the cell of the renal tubule through a port, probably an aquaporin, I would assume at this point, just a port protein to allow easy access to the cell membrane. And then the carbon dioxide molecule can diffuse directly through the phospholipid bilayer. And now we're in the cell of the renal tubules, and we have the water and we have the carbon dioxide. Inside of the cells of our renal tubules, that carbon dioxide is going to interact with carbonic anhydrase, so that the water molecule that has entered and the carbon dioxide molecule that has entered will interact with the carbonic anhydrase to reform carbonic acid. So now we've gone from carbonic acid in the blood plasma to carbonic acid in the cytoplasm of a cell that lines the renal tubules. And we're at step 5. At this point in time, the carbonic acid reionizes, and a bicarbonate ion, or hydrogen carbonate ion, is going to be pumped back into the bloodstream. And now we've lost a -1 ion from the cell. And over here, the hydrogen ion is going to be dumped into the filtrate, or the renal tubular fluid, as that urine is forming. So now we've lost a -1 and a +1 ion from the cell. To help power the movement of these ions, we need to have an antiporter. And we are going to use the sodium hydrogen antiporter. This sodium hydrogen antiporter is going to depend and be powered by a high concentration of sodium ions. And as sodium ions diffuse down their concentration gradient into the cell, that will power the movement of hydrogen ions out of the cell. To keep the concentration of sodium ions in the cell lower than the tubular fluid, we're going to have a sodium-potassium pump over here constantly burning through ATP to move potassium ions into the cell and sodium ions out of the cell. And that's where we use up a lot of our ATP that we have for our basal metabolic rate, that sodium-potassium pump right there. As we look at the hydrogen ion that has now been added to the filtrate or tubular fluid within our glomerulus, within the renal tubules, that hydrogen ion is going to bind to a bicarbonate ion. So we go from sodium bicarbonate in our renal fluid, the tubular filtrate, to a bicarbonate. The bicarbonate binds to a hydrogen, and we've reformed carbonic acid again. So ultimately, we've started at this point with carbonic acid in the blood. We turn that to carbonic acid in the cells of the renal tubule, and now we've turned that to carbonic acid in the forming urine, the filtrate. And in the filtrate, that carbonic acid is then going to interact with carbonic anhydrase. And we have carbonic anhydrase embedded in the cell membrane of these microvilli. It's a brush border enzyme. And it's going to, that carbonic anhydrase will turn the carbonic acid back into water and back into CO2. And that CO2 is capable of going back into the cell and being reprocessed in the cell of the renal tubules, and the water ultimately will be passed with our urine. And as that water passes with the urine, that water will carry that initial hydrogen ion with it, which was in the bloodstream. Because as we look at this sodium bicarbonate up here, there's only one hydrogen in this sodium bicarbonate. And then that one hydrogen molecule is turned into a 2 hydrogen molecule. And we've ultimately take that 2 hydrogen molecule and take those 2 hydrogens and eliminate those 2 hydrogens from the body. So this whole convoluted series of chemical reactions has resulted in the net loss of 1 hydrogen ion from the bloodstream and the net addition of 1 hydrogen atom into the urine, lowering our overall body's pH. Ooh, this was a big slide. This was beefy. Let's move on to our next slide. So, we also have tubular buffers in our bodies. These tubular buffers are buffers within our renal filtrate, or the filtrate that's absorbing that's being turned into urine. And as we look at the phosphate buffering system, we take dibasic sodium phosphate, which is a nice way of saying that we have NaHPO4, this dibasic sodium phosphate that's already within the filtrate. And that dibasic sodium phosphate, which by the way makes excellent laundry detergent. It's too bad, well, it's not too bad. It's a good thing for our nation's waterways that we no longer add dibasic sodium phosphate to laundry detergent. But if you really want to get your clothes clean, you used to be able to get phosphate-based soaps for your laundry. But that's a tangent we don't have time for right now. So as we look at this dibasic sodium phosphate, it can bind to hydrogen ions that are being added to the filtrate. And as that hydrogen ion is added to the filtrate, it displaces one of the sodium ions, and that one sodium ion can then be dumped back into the cell, and that sodium ion raises the filtrate's sodium concentration. Sodium diffuses down its concentration gradient back into the cell, powering the hydrogen-sodium antiporter. And then to keep the sodium concentrations in the cell low, we have the sodium-potassium pump constantly burning through ATP, dumping sodium back into the bloodstream. So ultimately, as we acidify the urine, we dump sodium into the blood, based off of our phosphate buffering system within our kidneys. This is much simpler than the last slide. And let's talk about the ammonia buffering system. So we have ammonia present in our filtrate. And as we add hydrogen ions to our filtrate, those hydrogen ions bind to the ammonia and will also bind to chloride ions, which are naturally present in the filtrate. So if we have an ammonia plus a hydrogen plus a chloride, we get ammonium chloride, which is a very weak acid. And we have a net result of losing one hydrogen ion from the inside of the cell and adding one hydrogen ion to the urine, so that we're losing hydrogen ions from the body when we urinate. So that is respiratory and renal control of our blood pH and body's pH. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the class discussion boards or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.